Hello everyone. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to give a talk on this topic, Innovating Nursing Skills Education with Technology. I am Thomas Choi from the Center for Smart Health School of Nursing, the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. In this talk, I'm going to talk about how technology could be applied to nursing. And when we talk about innovations, innovation embrace a lot of elements. And to innovate, there are many techniques, there are many ways to innovate. And in fact, technology is just one of the ways to innovate, to generate new ideas. And there are many other approaches to come up with innovations. And when we talk about technology, in fact, there are also a lot of technology that you can make use of. As I listed here, for example, all the way from genetic engineering, bioengineering, and to robotics, computing, wearables, and even like artificial intelligence that are hot topics nowadays. And today, in this talk, I'm going to focus more on virtual reality. In fact, in the past 10, 20 years, I have been doing quite a lot in virtual reality. As you can see from these slides, I try to list out the work that I've done over the years, all the way from surgical simulation at the beginning, and then I also work on application about nursing. In particular, I developed a virtual psychiatric ward. And then later on, I focus on some rehabilitation applications. And more recently, I use some kind of so-called desktop-based virtual reality for clinical skills training, such as brain injury treatments and hemodialysis training. And then also on nursing, and then continue to work on surgical simulations. And then more recently, I have developed an application about the learning of anatomy with stereo visions. Okay. And then a few years ago, there was a wound training simulators. And in particular, for this talk, okay, I'm going to talk about the application of virtual reality for the training of nasogastric tube placement. So what is this about? Basically, the idea actually comes from the fact that in clinical training, the static rubber mannequin has been commonly used for, as a substitution for training. And then because the rubber mannequin is not quite realistic, in fact, it is a conventional method, but we are thinking about whether there are some ways to improve the training by the use of virtual reality. And then in the development of this virtual reality application, we also make use of artificial intelligence to make the simulation more realistic. And you will see how it works in the following slides. Okay. Basically, here are a few slides about nasogastric tube placement. For nursing students, I believe you are very familiar with the backgrounds. Okay. Basically, it's a soft rubber tube to be inserted through the nostril to the stomach. Okay? And the purpose of this nasogastric tube insertion, NGT, is that most of the time you're going to feed the patient when the patient have problem in eating. Okay? And in other occasions, you will also want to take some sample from the stomach. And you may also want to remove some stomach content by making use of the rubber tube. Okay. And during the insertion of this NGT, something could happen. One of the things is that the patient will probably resist this because it's not a comfortable experience. When there are some resistance during the insertion process, you may want to slightly withdraw the tube and then reinsert it. And during the process, as I said earlier, that it is it is quite an uncomfortable experience actually. Then the patient may gag, and you may want to pause, stop a while, and then calm the patient. And as you know, the insertion process is basically a blind process. You don't really know where the tube is, and there are some way to verify the location of the tube. For example, you may want to inject some air through the tube, and then as you can see from this little diagram, that then you will put a stethoscope to see if there are some sound heard from the location of the stomach. So this is one way. And the other thing is you may want to remove some of the content from the stomach and then test the acidity. If it is around pH 5.5, then you may say that it's probably in the stomach, because the content there is acidic. Okay? And then the most reliable one is probably to have a chest X-ray. But usually we won't do that. Okay? We will make use of these two techniques. And as I mentioned earlier, NGT insertion is actually a blind process, and it requires some experience and skills and your interaction with the patients to determine whether the tube is actually reaching the stomach, and using the three techniques that I mentioned in the last slide to verify the location of the tube. But because this is actually a blind process, some complications may occur. For example, you thought the tube has reached the stomach, but it's actually reaching the lung, and this could actually cause pneumonia, and actually has led to some fatal cases as well. And the other thing is that the tube might puncture through some organs and then cause bleeding. For example, at least the organs here, like it may puncture the esophagus, some vessels, and the nasopharyngeals. Okay. So this is actually quite a risky process, even though nurses are doing this very often. And in fact, it is not that the complication is not that often, but once in a while you may heard about some complication that had occurred. And in the conventional training, we usually use mannequins. Okay? As I mentioned earlier, we use the rubber mannequins as a substitute of human for practice. But before that, we will first go through some lectures on the theories and principles, and then demonstrations by the instructors or using videos, and then using mannequins in the clinical lab for training. And then finally, you will practice. Okay? You will practice with patients in hospitals. Okay? So we are trying to see if there are some ways to improve or to enhance the conventional training process. Okay? And to this end, then we come up with the idea of using virtual reality, which is quite popular nowadays, and the technology is also quite mature nowadays. And this is the outlook of the virtual NGT placement that we have built some years ago. Okay? So I'm going to focus on the development process. So the features of this VR simulation system is that we are trying to tackle two issues. The first is that because when you're using the rubber mannequins, they are basically some plastic model not quite following the real anatomy of human body. So the first thing that we are trying to do is that we want to imitate the real anatomy of the human body. And then the second thing is when you are inserting the NGT into the mannequin, the feeling is not quite like the real interactions. So you're trying to simulate the intubation forces as well. And then there are also other features, such as we come up with a map that you can see the tube inside the body, but certainly this is a virtual see-through, not a real map. And then there are also some audio feedback, like the sound of coughing and gagging reflex. And then with the system, there are some quantitative measurements, such as the completion time, the location of the tube, during the insertion process, and also the intubation forces. Okay. And so first, about the anatomy, when we developed this virtual VR simulation system, we actually following the geometry from the visible human data sets, which was acquired from the National Library of Medicine in the United States. Okay. And then the other thing is about the insertion force, which is quite a non-trivial task. And then we try to simulate the force from different settings, like that's whether there is lubrication applied to the tubes, whether the patient has flexed the neck, and then most importantly, the speed of insertion and the depth of insertion. That is the location of the tube inside the body. So these are the four factors or four parameters that we try to model. Okay? And then go back to the to the insertion force modeling. As I said, this is non-trivial, and there are two. Basically, we use two techniques. First is we use the physics-based methods, and we use the methods so-called the finite element methods in engineering mechanics. And then the other thing is we use the AI, or we call it heuristics methods, and we use the fuzzy logic system. And we'll talk about these two in the following slides. But before that, I would like to also describe how difficult it is to model the intubation force. First of all, it's actually difficult to measure the real force, okay? Because there are no device that allow us to actually measure the force, the forces between the tube and the nasogastric pathway. Okay? There are no such sensors. And then the other thing is the geometry of the nasogastric passage is quite complicated. Okay? So let's begin with the physics-based method. So as I said, we are going to use this finite element methods, or a method that is very commonly used in civil engineering, in engineering mechanics. Basically, the idea is to model the nasogastric passage as a collection of simple shapes. For example, triangles. Then we are going to calculate the forces between the tube and each of these pieces of simple elements. And then later on, we're going to combine them to come up with the final forces that is supposed to be felt by the user. And this process using FEM is quite computational intensive. And therefore, we divide the simulation into two parts. Okay? The first part is given that the geometry of the nasal cavity is more complicated, then we will use the finite element methods for the computation, which is more accurate and is more suitable for tackling complex geometry. But because of the calculation is more complicated and time-consuming, then we will perform offline computation. And then when we are using the simulator, we just perform some online lookup at the previous results. So this is stage one. And this is the simulation results that we have produced. You can see as the color here shows that the forces will be different at different part of the nasal cavity. And then next, for the sections of the esophagus, because the geometry is relatively more simple, then we will just use some analytical methods to calculate the force and in real time. So we make use of these two-stage methods to calculate the insertion force during the virtual intubation process. Okay? And then the second method is about using fuzzy logic system. The problem with the first method is that even though we can come up with a very accurate model, we don't really know, as I said earlier, we don't really know how to determine the parameters for the model, and particularly the accurate parameters of the model, because we don't have the device to measure the real forces. Still, we need to ask the user, experienced nurses, to tell us how they feel with this so-called physics-based model, and then we will tune the parameters. And because of this, then we think about why not we just ask the experienced nurses directly about how they feel during the intubation process, and then we come up with the models directly from user experience or from the expert's experience. And this is the second method that I'm going to present. And with this model, because it's actually rely on the expert's experience, and because these are actually, after all, they are human experience, there will be some variation between different experts. And then we come up with a so-called a fuzzy logic system that allow us to kind of come up with a generalized model that take care of different experts, and then come up with a force model to calculate the computation forces in real time. And then with these forces, with this model, then we are going to capture the perceptions of the users regarding the force and the speed of placement. And then we're going to build up some fuzzy rules between the forces and the placement condition, and then we'll calculate the force. And this is illustrated with this diagram. We have the 4 parameters that I've mentioned earlier, and then we will develop a fuzzy rule base, and then create the and then calculate the insertion force. But then, because this is about the perception of user, then we need to understand the perception. So there are some experiments that we have to conduct beforehand to understand how do an expert consider a force as a strong force or a weak force. How do they perceive a speed as a fast or a slow speed? So this is actually done by using using experiment with a haptic device like this, and then we will ask the user to maneuver this haptic stylus, and then this system will generate a weak force, a force of different magnitudes, and then we will ask the user how do they feel, whether this is a strong or weak, how weak or how strong it is, how fast or how slow it is when they are moving the stylus. Okay. So this is how we understand the perceptions, and then come up with a set of user data to generate the fuzzy system. And then regarding the fuzzy rules, then we will use some questionnaires like this, and then we will come up with some question asking the experts under different conditions, and then based on their previous experience, what are the amount or what are the magnitude of forces that they will usually experience. For example, if there is lubrication, if the lubrication is poor, if the position of the tube is in the nasal cavity, then what is the force change? Okay, and these are the feedback, or these are the feedback from the based on the experience of the nurses. So with these 2 pieces of information, then we will come up with a fuzzy logic system that I mentioned earlier. So now let me show you the graphical interface of the system. You have seen this in the previous slide. Basically, you have the haptic device, which is here, and then attaching to a tube to mimic the NGT. And then this is the user interface that you actually look at this virtual environment as if you are actually doing the insertion in the physical world. And then this is the GUI, the graphical user interface. And this is the side view, front view. And then there are some instruction and procedures. And then this is the map that I just mentioned earlier. You can see where the tube is during the insertions. And then there's a graph showing the force during the insertions. Okay. I think the best way for me to illustrate this is to show you a video. Okay, this is the system. There is a 3D printed head model, and then the haptic device is at the back. And then this is the the graphical user interface. And then this is the virtual NGT, and also the virtual hand of the user. And ideally, the user should only focus on the screen, as if they are actually doing the real simulation. So this is the instructions and guidance for the user at different stages when they are preparing, they are doing the insertions, and what they are supposed to do to confirm the placement. So these are some instruction and guidance for them. And then this is the see-through map that I mentioned earlier. And this is the force profile during the insertion process. And as you can see here, there's a micro switch. When you're pressing the switch, the system considers this as the action of holding the tube. And when you are inserting the tube with this haptic device, and you will see the virtual hand doing the insertion as well. Okay. And then you will see the tube being inserted inside the body. And certainly this is for training purpose. You're not going to see it in real settings. Okay? And then you will see the change of forces over time. And with this system, we actually simulated the two cases. Okay? When the tube is inserting into the esophagus. And then when the tube is reaching around this area, actually the system will play a gagging sound. So it is more interactive when compared to the rubber mannequin. And then this is actually, we are trying to simulate the area as well, where the tube, instead of going into the esophagus, it might enter the trachea as well. And then at this point, the system will play a coughing sound. Okay. So now you have seen the video. So let's come back to the pilot study that we have done using the virtual training system. So in this pilot study, we have conducted a pre-post test study, and then there were two groups of subjects. Actually, they were both pre-registration nursing students, and then for the control group, they followed the usual training using rubber mannequins, and then for the intervention groups, they used that virtual NGT placement training simulator in addition. Okay. And the study arrangement is like this. In the pre-test, the knowledge test, which is a multiple choice questions about the NGT placements. And the knowledge acceptance is about the users or the subjects' acceptance to the use of technology for clinical training. Okay? And then we use the technology acceptance model, TAM, to measure the acceptance to the virtual training system. And for the intervention, as I said earlier, the control group would follow the usual training, and then the intervention group will use virtual training in the virtual NGT system, training system in addition. And then in the post-test, both groups would go through the knowledge test, technology acceptance, questionnaires, and also a skill competence. Okay? The skill competence here is basically the instructor evaluating their hands-on skills after the interventions. And then finally, for the intervention group, we also asked them about the usability of the virtual NGT system. Okay? And the results was that the student actually is quite satisfied with the usability of the system, and then the acceptance of this virtual training system is also quite good. And we also find that the intervention group achieved a higher knowledge test score after using the virtual training system. However, the skill competence the skill competence was actually quite comparable for the two groups. There are several reasons for that, because this group of students are actually coming from different programs, and we probably need to have a better mix of the two groups, or actually come up with a equivalence group testing. Okay? And then the other thing is the duration of the virtual training is yet to be, or actually the dose stage of the training is yet to be determined. And also we probably need a larger sample size for the study. And nevertheless, virtual training appears to be quite promising. And in this table, I'm trying to list out the differences between the two, the usual method and the virtual reality-based method. Basically, for the virtual reality-based methods, we use the real human anatomy, and then we simulate the forces, which is unlike the rubber mannequin. It's basically some interaction between rubber and the plastic tube, where we try to simulate this. And then, as you can see, that it is more interactive in terms of visual and audio feedback. And then there's a visual map, and then the data can be logged quantitatively with the system. And after we developed this prototype system, we continue to further to carry out further investigation. And actually, this system has been patented and licensed. And then we are trying to actually extend it to not just NGT insertions, but also other kind of clinical intubation, such as urinary catheterization, suctioning, and also like trachea intubation. And then we also try to come up with a simulation for different patients of different age groups as well. And then finally, I would like to conclude our experience from this project. And as I mentioned earlier, that actually nowadays the virtual reality technology is quite mature, and it is actually quite possible for us to realize clinical simulation with better and higher fidelity and realism. And in nursing, because it involves many manual skills, and actually VR is quite a promising option to enhance the conventional training. Okay. But having said that, for those of you who have experience in developing VR simulators, you must know that it is actually quite time-consuming, resource demanding, and in fact, even though the technology is quite mature compared to 10 or 20 years ago, but there is still a lot of room for improvement. In particular, the sense of touch is not very much or very well simulated with the current technology. And we are not able to come up with a level of fidelity that is very, very similar to those in the physical world. And then the final point that I would like to raise is that actually regarding the application of technology into healthcare, in this case, the application of VR to nursing, it is in fact involving people from two different mindsets. And because of this, communication is very important. Okay, communication between these two groups of people is very, very important. And there will also need some mediators in between who have the knowledge of both domains to actually come up with some compromise or some balance between the requirement and the technology levels available. So I think that's, I would like to conclude with this presentation. And if you are interested in the patient simulators, you may want to check the website with this QR code. And that there are also some references about the presentation that I just gave to you. So thank you for your interest with this presentation.